Hey guys, tonight we begin with the faint scent of burning rosemary, a cracked wooden door, and the quiet terror of a cough in the dark. The world outside is quiet, but not peaceful. There's a stillness in the air, not the kind that comforts, but the kind that makes you hold your breath just a second longer than usual. You see, the wind carries more than cold these days. It carries questions. It carries fear. It carries the soft, unspoken knowledge that something isn't right. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from. What time is it where you are? Tonight, we won't chase kings or knights or stories etched in gold. Instead, we'll wander down crooked alleyways and into homes where straw litters the floor, and silence is thick with superstition. We'll sit at the edge of a bed where someone hasn't slept well in weeks, not from guilt or gossip, but because breathing itself has become an act of courage. This is a world where water is feared and soot is sacred, where a mother might wipe her child's face with ashes, not because she's cruel, but because she cares. Because the soot, somehow, feels safer than the water. The plague is not just a sickness here. It's a whisper in the well, a shadow in the rafters, a reason to close every shutter, even when it's hot. But behind those shutters, life goes on, quietly, tenderly, with hands that tremble but keep washing, with bread that's shared, even if it's stale, with prayers that are murmured more for the living than the dead. And so we begin, not with numbers or names, but with a story. One that unfolds slowly, like steam rising from a forgotten pot. A story of how people stayed human, even when the world around them tried to forget what that meant. Close your eyes if you'd like. You're safe here. And the story is just beginning. It began as a scratch, nothing more. Just a soft drag of fingers along skin beneath the thick wool tunic that hadn't been washed in months, or maybe years. It was late evening, the kind where the light slips through the cracks in the timber, golden and tired, the kind that doesn't quite warm the room, only makes it glow like an old candle burning itself down. And there they sat, on a bench made of splintered wood, hands roughened by work, knuckles dry and cracked, fingernails ringed with soil from a field no longer theirs, taken not by man, but by death, by drought, by the silence that spread like mold on the breadbox. The itch came again, and again. It wasn't from dirt, or at least not just that. It was the kind of itch that came from being alive too long in too little comfort. It was from wool grown heavy with sweat and time, from underclothes worn until they stopped feeling like fabric and became a second skin, itchy, oily, loyal. It was fleas. Of course it was fleas, but no one said that aloud. That would be impolite. Instead, they scratched in rhythm with the fire's crackle, a chorus of fingers across scalps, backs, thighs, gentle, private, like prayer. The hearth didn't burn so much as breathe, a faint glow beneath the ashes, the promise of heat rather than its delivery. The mother stoked it with a twig, careful, not to use the good kindling. That was for cooking. This was for warmth. And warmth, tonight, was rationed like bread. She glanced at her daughter, 8 years old, maybe 7. It was hard to keep track when the months were measured by funerals. The child scratched too, not with shame. Children never have shame about such things, but with focus, like a task. And still, they didn't speak of it. No one ever said, "We are infested." They said, "It's the wool." They said, "The air is too still tonight." They said, "There must be something in the hay." But everyone knew the fleas were part of the home. They lived in the cracks of the bed frame, in the folds of the tunics, in the hats left by the door. They moved with the family, from fields to town to plague shelter to nowhere at all. always biting, always here. And somehow, it was normal. To itch was to live. To not itch might mean the worst had already come. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. At the edge of the room, a boy stirred. Not from sleep, but from discomfort. The sort of restless twist that comes when your body wants relief, but your world has no language for it. He was too old to complain, too young to endure. So he scratched and rolled and sighed. A soft exhale, like a song no one wrote down. Their clothes were not layered for fashion. They were layered to trap heat. 3 tunics, a belt, a cloak, all worn inside. Not because it was cold, though it was, but because the body had to stay wrapped. Nakedness was a risk, not just of chill, but of exposure to something nameless. As if the plague could smell bare skin. They washed when they could, but wash was a generous word. It meant wiping down with a cold cloth, or rubbing ashes onto the arms like soap. It meant pouring water from a bowl they hadn't emptied in days, not because they forgot, but because water was sacred now. Every drop, a decision. To itch was to remember your body. To forget it, that meant fever. That meant stillness. That meant you stopped scratching because you no longer noticed, because the fleas stopped biting you first, because the plague had noticed before anyone else did. The father sat nearest the fire. His eyes were closed, not sleeping, just resting, where the orange glow touched his face. His hands moved to his beard, not grooming, just searching. Something small crawled across his cheek. He didn't swat it away. He let it pass, because hygiene had changed. It wasn't about being clean anymore. It was about being alive. And so, the line between filth and comfort blurred. Some said lice left the dying first, that the fleas jumped from cold skin to warm, that rats abandoned ships, yes, but they also abandoned the still, the breathless, the doomed. In this way, pests became prophets, and the itching became a gift. No one wanted to be too clean. The bathhouses had closed. The barbers bled people. Dry. And the water could kill you just as surely as the plague. So they scratched. They itched. They accepted it. It was routine. It was ritual. It was, in some strange way, human. And when night came fully, and the fire hissed into silence, and the scratching slowed, not because the fleas were gone, but because exhaustion had taken hold, there was peace, not from cleanliness, but from surrender. A mother lying next to her daughter, both layered in blankets stiff with age and smoke. A father curled by the fire, one boot still on. A son stretched across a straw mattress, biting his lip in sleep. And somewhere in the walls, the gentle, sacred sound of scratching. Because in a world of death and superstition and silence, that itch meant something was still alive, even if it was only the fleas. There was a time when the scent of sweat wasn't something to scrub away. It was proof you were still working, still useful, still here. In the world we're slipping into tonight, one of crumbling mortar, flickering candles, and footsteps soft with caution. Hygiene wasn't measured in scentlessness or sparkle. It was something quieter, something spiritual, something improvised. Soap, if you could find it, was hoarded. Not the fragrant, bubbly kind we know now, but something hard, gray, bitter-smelling. And it stung. It stung the cracks in your hands and the cuts on your knees. It wasn't comforting. It was a punishment for trying to be clean. So instead, they turned to soot. The black, powdery ash left behind from burning wood, dried herbs, scraps of cloth. It stuck to the fingers, settled into pores. It didn't cleanse, not really, but it felt like it did. It masked the oil, absorbed the smell, left a kind of dull film that, in those days, was mistaken for protection. To rub soot on your skin was not madness. It was survival. It meant you were doing something. It meant you hadn't given up. In one small home, tucked between others like it, leaning walls pressed close like tired neighbors. A woman crouched by the hearth. Her hands were blackened, not from labor, though she'd done plenty, but from ritual. She dipped her fingers into the ash, gently dabbing behind her ears, across her brow, down her neck. A holy gesture, almost. Like a cross, like a prayer. She wasn't alone in this. Men anointed themselves before going to market. Children smeared soot onto cheeks before school, for church, for nothing at all. Not to hide, but to blend in, to not smell too different. Because difference drew attention. And attention drew suspicion. And in plague years, suspicion was a death sentence. The church had much to say about cleanliness. Not of the body. That was vanity, but of the soul. Washing in their eyes was indulgence. Why clean your flesh when the spirit within could rot? So sweat was worn like armor. Oils, sacred, perfumed, hallowed, were dabbed sparingly, if at all. Lavender for mourning, frankincense for the sick, rosemary for protection. These were not luxury. They were defense. A drop behind each ear, a trace at the collarbone. Enough to scent the air around you, not enough to offend heaven. The apothecary's shelf was lined with glass jars, not all of them full, most with contents dried, curled at the edges, crushed petals, burnt bark, wax thick with dust. But still, people came, quietly, desperately. Something to mask it, they'd whisper. Something to keep the smell from getting in, because they believed, with every breath, that the air itself was a carrier. That scent was not just unpleasant, but deadly. That if the wrong smell got into your nose, it could settle in your blood. That perfume could be a shield. And so they sweated. They scrubbed with cloth, with sand, with salt. And afterward, they dabbed oil on their wrists like they were sealing a letter. A letter to no one. A letter to survive. Sometimes, a woman would pass by in the street, and her scent, cloves, and something smoky would trail behind like memory. Heads would turn, not from attraction, but from awe, because she had managed, somehow, to soften the plague with perfume. And that was a kind of magic. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only. If it feels right. In the home again, beside that fire gone to embers, the same woman smoothed soot across her child's forehead. A line, dark and perfect, not for cleanliness, not even for health, but for luck. The child didn't flinch. She was used to the feeling, dry, powdery, gritty, and when she smiled, a bit of ash cracked at the corner of her lips. The mother had tried washing her once. Boiled water, cloth, a full half-hour of scrubbing. But the next morning, the girl came down with a fever, and the mother never tried again. Clean skin, she believed now, was too vulnerable, too bare, too tempting for the sickness to notice. So soot it was. And sweat, the body's own way of purging whatever wrongness lived beneath the ribs. To sweat through your clothes, through your mattress, was not a failure. It was faith, that your body still fought for you. And the oils, well, they were expensive, but people traded for them. A jar of garlic for a drop of sage. A sack of flour for half a thimble of myrrh. Because smell mattered. Because smell meant control. Over your space. Over your fear. Over the story your body told the world. The old man who lived near the edge of the village had no soap, but every night he rubbed rosemary into his beard, said it kept the dreams clean. And when he passed in his sleep, weeks later, his room still smelled like the forest. They said that was a good death dot in that time. Scent was memory. Sweat was prayer. Soot was safety dot. No one bathed, but everyone anointed. Not to erase the dirt, but to keep its sacred dot. And as night stretched its arms across the village, and the chimneys sent up the last curls of smoke, and the air filled with sweat, ash, and clove, people lay down on straw, not clean, but blessed, and they slept, wrapped, not in linen or wool, but in the soft, sacred fog of soot, sweat, and sacred oils. They weren't villains, not really. Not in that world. Not in the way we imagine them now, under microscopes and warning labels and plastic combs. No, lice were just there, tiny, tenacious, a part of the fabric of living, as constant as the wind, as ordinary as breathing. They moved silently, through families, across collars and cuffs, from scalp to scalp in soft beds shared by three, from the woven caps passed down winter after winter, their warmth outlasting their purpose. They whispered in the ears of the poor, the sick, the sleeping. But they did not shout. They never needed to dot in one small home. Beneath a sagging roof patched with soot-dark cloth, a girl sat with her knees to her chest, her mother behind her. A comb, old, wooden, with half its teeth worn dull, worked gently through strands of hair that hadn't seen water in weeks. The girl didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She only blinked slowly as the teeth passed through again and again, not in anger, not in shame, but in silence, because this was their ritual. Each morning or each night, whenever there was light and stillness and enough, patience to pull something sacred from something miserable. A mother's fingers parting the hair, a child's head bowed, the lice, as always, present, but uninvited. No one spoke of them aloud. You could speak of rats, of rot, of death, but lice were a quiet shame. If you have them, the old women would say, you must have been close to someone, as though affection were a sin, as though the price of warmth, of company, of closeness, was this constant crawl upon a scalp. And yet, lice were everywhere. In the hoods of the monks, in the braids of daughters, in the beards of fathers who still kissed their children good night, even in the beds of the dead, waiting always for the warmth to return. Combing continued. Each stroke an act of love, each stroke a reminder that someone still cared whether you were suffering. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. There was an art to it, a rhythm. Dip the comb in oil. If there was oil, wipe it on cloth. Examine what clung to the teeth. Flick the lice into the hearth, where even they did not escape. The fire hissed quietly with each offering, and in that hiss, the house breathed. Sometimes you could hear it in church, the slow drag of fingers behind ears, the quiet scratch beneath a veil, a choir of itches held beneath layers of wool and shame. But no one looked up. No one judged, because they all knew. To be lice-free meant one of three things. You were very rich, you were very lucky, or you were very dead. Lice didn't like corpses. They didn't like cold. They needed heat, life, movement. So the presence of lice meant you were still worth crawling on. That was the irony. The bitter joke whispered among the women as they picked at their children's heads. Best not to. Be too clean, they'd mutter, or the lice might think you've passed. In some villages, there were tools passed down not as heirlooms, but as survival kits. A particular comb, a certain cloth, a recipe of vinegar, and rosemary too. Precious to waste on flavor. These weren't solutions, just rituals. Ways to say, we are trying. Ways to say, we still care. And in a world where everything smelled of ash and unspoken grief, caring was the rarest form of hygiene. A child's braid, redone every morning. A hat lined with Wool, turned inside out each night. A prayer muttered while combing, not to ward off lice, but to keep the hands steady. No one believed lice caused the plague, but they reminded people that bodies were porous, fragile, temporary, that even the tiniest things could burrow into you, unseen, and make themselves at home. There was a girl once, the stories say, whose mother combed her every morning, with such love it made the neighbors jealous. One day, the combing stopped, and the scratching too, and that silence, heavier than death, settled in like dust, because in that world, silence meant more than absence. It meant something had been lost, a warmth, a rhythm, a reason to comb. And so, the lice were not just pests, they were proof of presence, of contact, of care. Even now, the memory of a fingernail lightly tracing the scalp, parting the hair, catching something that does not belong. It lives in us, not as disgust, but as connection. And when the fires burn low, and the skin itches just enough to remember, and the bed creaks with a shared weight, we return, in our minds, to that room, where the lice were quiet, the hands were kind, and the silence, somehow, felt sacred. It used to be trusted. Before the sickness, before the wells whispered rumors, and the rivers lost their innocence, water was life, until it wasn't. And in those dark years, it became something else entirely. Something quiet, something watched, something no longer welcome in the routines of the living. In one small cottage, half swallowed by moss and memory, a basin sat near the door. It was once a place of washing, a bowl for hands, for feet, for faces still flush with the color of movement. Now it held only dust. The water had not been changed in weeks, not because they forgot, but because they feared. A drop could carry death, they said. Not the kind you could see, not even the kind you could smell, but the kind that snuck in through the skin, that settled in the bones, that made a man cough in the night and stop waking by morning. And so they stopped using it. They wiped clean, with cloth, rubbed with soot, dabbed with oil. But the water, the true, clear water, was left to wait. Children were taught not to drink too deeply, to sip slowly, to pray first. If it comes from the well, speak to it kindly, the old woman would whisper, as if it's listening, because maybe it is. They weren't foolish. They weren't backward. They were scared. And when people are scared, even purity becomes suspicious. The rivers still ran, of course, thin blue threads across the countryside, but no one bathed in them anymore. Not after the sickness was seen floating downstream, face down, cloaked in rags. The fishermen wrapped cloth around their noses. The washerwomen moved their work inland, scrubbing garments dry instead of wet. Even the animals drank less, as if they too had learned to doubt. Water was no longer shared. No communal ladles. No buckets passed from hand to hand. If you needed a drink, you took your own cup, or went without. And in homes where the sick lay breathing thin and slow, the water was covered, sealed with cloth, prayed over, left untouched. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. A boy, perhaps 10, once dipped his hands in a stream. It was warm. It was beautiful. He watched the ripples stretch out like arms, reaching into nowhere. He didn't tell his mother. That night, he developed a fever. And by morning, the stream was cursed, or so they said. It wasn't that water changed. It was that they no longer understood it. Before, they trusted the wells, lowered the bucket, drawn it up with both hands, laughed at the splash. Now, they lowered it and held their breath. They sniffed the surface, watched for things that shouldn't be there. Shadows, strands, bubbles. Sometimes they poured it away entirely. just to be safe, and those who still bathed did so in secret. A woman would slip into a tub in the dark, a pot of boiled water, poured carefully down her back, not for comfort, but for silence, so no one would see her vanity, so no one would call it reckless. Bathing became shameful, not because of modesty, but because it meant tempting fate. Only the dying bathe, some said, to be clean, was to prepare your body for burial. And so they stayed wrapped, layer upon layer, cloth over cloth. Even in summer, even in heat, sweat was trusted more than water. In some homes, the only time water touched skin was for the dead. A cloth dipped just once, brushed across the forehead. An act not of hygiene, but of farewell. And in that moment, water found its place again, not as sustenance, but as ritual. The irony was that thirst remained. People drank. They had to. But always carefully. Always with eyes lowered. They blessed their cups, whispered apologies to the stream, held their breath when swallowing, as if the water might bite. And still, some drank deep. They could not afford to fear. Their work was in the fields, the streets, the dust. They drank and hoped. They drank and survived, because water had not betrayed them. Only their world had changed, and so water became a memory of baths with laughter, of children splashing mud from their shins, of lovers rinsing sweat from each other's backs in the late twilight of summer. Those memories stayed locked behind shutters and cloth-covered pitchers, not lost, just waiting for a world where fear no longer lived at the bottom of every cup. And maybe, just maybe, when the sickness passed and the wells were blessed again and the river sang instead of wept, water would be welcomed back, poured freely, touched often, but for now it sat still, feared, and slowly forgotten. They didn't arrive like heroes, not on horseback, not with banners, but through mist, quietly, their silhouettes long and strange, like something remembered from a dream. They looked like birds, or nightmares, or both. The beaked mask came first, long, curved, unnatural. It hid the face entirely, eyes covered in glass, voice muffled, breath hollow. They didn't look human, and that, perhaps, was the point, because the plague did not recognize kindness. It did not respect gentleness, or grief, or gold. And so, the doctors wore armor made of leather and fear. The robes were long, waxed and heavy, gloves at the ends, boots tucked beneath. They were sealed from the world, from the sick, from the scent. Because back then, smell was blamed. Not germs, not air, but odor, foul and thick and unholy. So inside that beak, they packed perfumes, herbs, spices, cloves, mint, vinegar-soaked rags, a small garden of protection, inches from the nose. And when they breathed through rosemary, not just for comfort, but for survival. In some homes, children whispered of them like ghosts. Don't stare too long, they said, or they'll take you away. But others watched through the cracks in shutters, hoping one would pass, because a plague doctor meant someone still cared enough to come. Even if they looked like death, they carried canes, not for walking, but for distance. They pointed with them, pushed open doors, lifted blankets, checked pulses without touching skin. Touch, after all, had become dangerous. A handshake, a hug, a hand on the forehead, all forbiddance. So the cane became their finger, their voice, their wall. They spoke little. When they did, the voice came flat, like breath through cloth. And in the room, people froze. Not from fear of the doctor, but from what his presence confirmed. No one called a plague doctor early. They came when hope had already begun to thin, when the coughing deepened, when the house grew too quiet, and yet they came. That strange bird-faced figure, carrying not a cure, but a kind of order. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Some say they wrote in ledgers, names, ages, final words. They marked homes with chalk, drew lines above doors, not for the dead, but for those too weak to speak for themselves. And they saw things, more than any priest or merchant or mother ever would. They saw entire families, curled together in bed, unmoving. They saw bodies dressed in Sunday best, waiting for funerals that would never come. They saw the slow unraveling of villages, one house at a time, and yet they kept walking, boots heavy, breath slow, eyes behind glass, because someone had to, not to heal. No one expected that, but to bear witness, to confirm what the wind already whispered, that another name had been lost to the silence. Some plague doctors tried remedies. They lanced buboes, mixed tonics, prayed quietly behind their masks, not because they believed, but because they had nothing else. Others simply watched. And when it was over, they moved on, from one home to the next, from one street of shuttered windows to another, leaving behind the scent of sage and sorrow. The masks were never removed in public. Some said they wore them to bed, that they slept with the beak resting on the pillow beside them, as if even sleep wasn't safe. They were paid in coin, food, sometimes nothing at all. And many of them disappeared, not because the plague took them, though it often did, but because when the sickness waned, no one wanted the memory to remain. Their coats were burned, their ledgers thrown away, the masks buried in earth or sealed behind walls. Because to remember the doctor was to remember what it meant to need him. And so the bird became a myth, a costume at carnivals, a joke on stages, a symbol, strange, haunting, misunderstood. But once it was real, and it walked softly through cities of ash and silence, not as a savior, not as a monster, but as something in between and tonight. If you close your eyes, you might still see him, standing at a threshold, hand on the door, breath scented with time and terror, not speaking, not knocking, just waiting. There was laughter once, steam rising like clouds from stone floors, bare feet on wet wood, voices echoing softly against tiled walls. The bathhouse had always been there, not just a building, a rhythm, a meeting place, a ritual passed from parent to child, neighbor to neighbor, a place where bodies were not shameful, only tired, and warmth was something shared. But then, one morning, it was gone, not crumbled, not burned, just locked. The steam stopped, the laughter stilled, and no one ever bathed there again. The plague, they said, had crept into the water, or into the walls, or into the skin of the last man who scrubbed his back with rosemary and came home coughing. No one saw him again. And so the doors were closed, nailed shut, a sign posted, not with words, most couldn't read them anyway, but with the symbol everyone feared, a cross drawn in ash. The bathhouse was dead. At first, they whispered about reopening it, just once, just for the elders, just for the holy days. But no one could bring themselves to touch the latch, because inside that place was not just heat and soap, but memory. And memory, now, was dangerous. In a village not far from the river, a bathhouse still stood, perfectly preserved, tiles unbroken, buckets stacked neatly along the wall. The dust gathered in thick layers, but the scent lingered. Lavender, lemon balm, wet stone, like a dream folded into the floor. A little girl once crept in through the back. She'd heard stories from her grandmother, of songs sung in the steam, of women braiding each other's hair with dripping hands. She wanted to hear those echoes. And she did, not with her ears, but with her skin. The room felt alive, like it was waiting to be warm again. But when she returned home, her mother scolded her, not with anger, with fear. And the girl never went back, because even the walls remembered. And some memories were not meant to be disturbed. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Before the plague, to bathe was to belong. The poor and the wealthy alike came to the bathhouse. For health, for gossip, for marriage. For morning. Steam was the great equalizer. Clothes came off, status dissolved. All were just bodies, fragile, fragrant, alive. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, arms resting on wet stone, eyes closed. Women sang lullabies to babies as warm water poured over their backs. Children splashed in shallow pools, their laughter echoing like bells. But then the laughter stopped, and the water stilled, and silence claimed the tiles. Some said it was the damp. That warmth opened the pores. That sickness snuck in when the body was too clean, too open. Others blamed the bathhouse for tempting fate. Too much comfort, they said. Too much skin. Too much joy. And so hygiene became private, silent, secret. A damp cloth by candlelight. A trickle of water poured behind closed shutters. No singing. No sharing. Only silence. In one city, an entire street of bathhouses was boarded overnight. No warning. No explanation. As if the buildings themselves had sinned. The steam became smoke. The songs became prayers. The bodies stayed hidden beneath wool and ash and oil. But memories do not vanish so easily. In quiet moments, the old still remembered. The feel of hot stone beneath their feet. The sound of dripping water. The comfort of a hand reaching through steam to pass a comb, or a towel, or a piece of bread. They remembered the baths not as luxury, but as proof that they once lived in a world unafraid of warmth. Now, even warmth was rationed. A fire lit in the hearth was no longer for bathing. It was for boiling water, sterilizing rags, burning infected cloth. It was war, not comfort. And the bathhouses remained, silent monuments to a gentler time. Their doors sealed, their pools dry, their echoes trapped beneath stone. Once a year, a woman left wildflowers on the steps of the largest bathhouse in town. No one knew her name. No one asked, but the flowers always vanished by morning, carried away by wind, or memory, or something else. And still, the building stood, as if waiting for water, for laughter, for the sound of a life that was clean, not from soap, but from fear. Perhaps one day the doors would open again. The steam would rise. The silence would break, and the bathhouse, long vanished, would remember how to sing God at night. The world softened. The noise fell away. The footsteps in the street grew few. And in homes that leaned inward from the cold, a different kind of ritual began. It wasn't a bath. It wasn't even water. It was cloth and flame and intention. A basin, a rag, a candle set in the middle of a wooden table, flickering like it too was afraid. This was how they cleaned themselves. Not with soap, not with steam, but with the patience of touch. One cloth, warmed near the fire, then passed gently across the neck, the forehead, behind the ears, the places where sweat whispered and soot settled, and the day clung like cobwebs. The hands were always last. They held the most story. They deserved the most time. No one rushed. This wasn't vanity. This was survival. And more than that, it was love. The kind of love you don't speak aloud. The kind that lives in small motions, wringing out the cloth, cooling it just enough, wiping gently, not to hurt. A mother would clean her child's face by candlelight. Not because the child was dirty, but because the world outside was dot, and inside, just for this moment, there could be softness. Fathers would do the same, sometimes awkwardly. A thumb smearing dirt from a cheek. A laugh under breath. A whisper. Hold still. Not because they believed it would stop the plague, but because it meant something hadn't changed. That even now, they could still tend to one another. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. In wealthier homes, there might be a bit of wine mixed into the cloth, vinegar, or oil infused with lavender. In the homes that had less, there was only warmth and the sound of cloth sliding across skin. But the candlelight made up the difference. It made every room holy, every face gentle. Every shadow seemed like company instead of threat. Because flame was the great storyteller. It moved with the wind, danced across faces, lit the same way for the poor and the rich. It made their acts feel sacred, even when they were nothing more than wiping dust from a tired brow. Sometimes they would do it alone. A girl with a chipped mirror, a boy with a cracked bowl, hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from cold. They would clean themselves not because anyone asked them to, but because it was one of the few things they could still control. Because, in a world where bodies collapsed in the street, where breath turned to silence without warning, the simple act of caring for your own skin was defiance. It said, I am still here. I still choose to live like this matters. In monasteries, the nuns cleaned the sick in this same light. They dipped cloth into water boiled with herbs. They wiped fevered faces. They sang, sometimes, softly, so the dying would feel something beautiful. At the end. No one called them clean. Their robes were stained. Their hands cracked. But what they gave was purity, even in silence, even in shadow. And so, all across the villages, the ritual continued. By firelight, by candlelight, by memory. A girl wiping her grandfather's face. A boy brushing ash from his mother's hands. A husband smoothing oil along his wife's collarbone, not for scent, but for comfort. They did not speak while they cleaned. Words would break the spell. It was enough to move slowly, to breathe carefully, to listen to the sound of the flame. Sometimes afterward, they would sit in silence, just watching the wick burn shorter, watching their hands, now clean, now stilled. The plague still existed. It still crouched beyond the door, waiting. But for this moment, in this quiet glow, they had done what they could, and that was enough. Cleanliness by candlelight was never about being clean. It was about remembering softness, touch, attention. It was about saying, here you are. Let me see you. Let me tend to what the world tries so hard to break. And as the candle burned lower, and the cloth cooled, and the fire in the hearth turned from flame to ember, they knew sleep would come easier, not because they were safe, but because they were seen. The fire burned down to memory, and what it left behind was ash, fine, gray, weightless. It drifted through the hearth, settled on wooden beams, gathered at the corners of the room like forgotten blessings. And though it looked like dirt, it wasn't. Not to them, not to them. Ash was holy. Not in the way that churches were, but in the way a kiss on the forehead can be holy. In the way a last embrace feels sacred, even when your hands are stained. Ash was what remained when warmth was gone. And so they kept it. They used it. They believed in it, not because it made them clean, but because it made them feel protected. Each morning, before the shutters were opened, a woman would take a small clay bowl from beside the hearth. Inside, the ashes from the night before. Still, warm, maybe. Still holding the scent of rosemary, or thyme, or whatever scraps she had thrown on the flames to mask the sickness in the air. She dipped 2 fingers in the ash, drew a line across her brow, then across her daughter's, then across the door. 3 gestures, 3 prayers, no words, just ash. And belief. Some called it superstition, but those who lived through it knew better. In a world where the air could kill you, where breath was a risk and a knock at the door could mean goodbye, ash was a shield, a soft one, a humble one, but a shield nonetheless. Clung to their sleeves, smudged across their cheeks. They rubbed it into their hands before meals, brushed it into their hair before leaving the house. They didn't wash it away. They wore it, like armor, like memory. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe. If you'd like more nights like this. Even the priests began to understand. Ash Wednesday was not just a date anymore. It was a daily ritual, an anointment, a way to say, we remember, we remain. In some homes, ash was mixed with oil, olive if they could spare it, animal fat if they couldn't, rubbed onto the skin like balm. It made them shine. It sealed the pores. It gave the illusion of care in a world that had forgotten how to offer it. They dabbed it on babies' foreheads, on the sick, on themselves. Before sleep. It wasn't pretty, but it was intimate, and intimacy was rare. Sometimes a woman would keep a small pouch of ash around her neck, worn close to the chest, a whisper of heat long since past, a reminder of something that once burned bright. She didn't talk about it, but her fingers would find it when she prayed, when she worried, when she waited for someone who didn't return. Ash was grief and grace and grit all at once. Play with it, not knowing its weight. Draw circles on the floor, asterisk smudge shapes on the walls. Their laughter, brief and precious, rising in the dust like birds startled from a tree. But even they knew to respect it. They watched how their mothers used it, how their fathers never swept it too quickly, how the old women carried it in tiny jars, wrapped in cloth. Ash had stories. It remembered everything the fire touched, every letter burned, every fever warmed, every meal cooked in silence. And so they did not toss it out. They used it to bless, to protect, to feel something that wasn't fear. One man, it said, painted crosses on his barn door with ash each night, not because he thought it would save him, but because it made him feel seen, even if only by the wind. A woman mixed it into the floor straw of her cottage. She said it kept the sickness from settling in. Or maybe it just made the home feel lived in. Ash got under fingernails, into bedsheets, into bread, but no one complained, because it was better than emptiness, better than the feeling that nothing could be done. And in the end, perhaps, ash was just a way of saying, we are still here. We have burned, but we remain. And this gray, this dust, this quiet residue is our proof. So they kept the bowls by the hearth. They anointed each other, not like kings, but like kin, with fingertips and silence, with warmth remembered. And when the fire burned, low again, and the day was done, and the world outside pressed like frost against the shutters, they closed their eyes and dreamed not of gold or soap or saints, but of ashes. Sacred, soft, and still warm. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't hidden, but it was part of life, even in a world shaped by plagues, by whispers, by the rustle of straw in the middle of the night. People still had to go. And so, in the corners of cottages, beside beds that creaked under too many bodies, there stood a chamber pot, ceramic, tin, sometimes carved from wood. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't meant to be, but it was there, every morning, every night, quiet, necessary. There was no plumbing, no pipes beneath the floor, No water that whooshed things away with a flick of a lever. There was only gravity. And shame. They didn't speak of it, not directly. A child might say, "The pot's full." An elder might grunt and gesture toward the door. And someone, always someone, would carry it out, balanced carefully, like a bowl of fragile secrets. Out the door, down the steps, to the window. Yes, the window. Because sometimes, in tightly packed towns where alleys curled like veins through stone and timber, they didn't walk the chamber pot all the way to the edge of the village. No, they tossed it right into the street, but not without warning. Gardy-loo? That was the cry in some cities. A word flung out before the waist. A warning, a plea, a ritual. Others had no word. Just a grunt, or the bang of the shutters before the splash. And so, streets weren't just muddy. They were layered with yesterday's dinners, today's sickness, and the quiet shame of midnight needs. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Children skipped through those streets by day. They knew where to step. They learned young to walk on the high stones, to keep their shoes, if they had shoes, clean. But still, the smell lingered. Even in churches, the scent curled up through the wooden floorboards. Even in markets, beneath baskets of bread, it hummed beneath everything. And yet, this was normal, because what else could they do? Some dug holes, small, shallow, covered with boards and dried leaves. But even those filled too fast in crowded towns. And the sickness didn't care where the waste was buried. So they lived with it. The stench, the ritual, the understanding that cleanliness in this way was never going to come. Women cleaned the chamber pots daily, some with vinegar, some with ash, most with a grimace and strong hands. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Like cooking, like sweeping, like combing lice from a child's scalp. An act of care, an act of love, even if you looked close. Enough. The pots were often shared. A family of 5. A single pot passed like bread, used without question. Because needs came before pride. And the plague taught them that fast. In larger homes, there might be more than one. Some tucked into alcoves, others behind curtains. But the ritual was the same. Night fell. The candle flickered. The room hushed. And someone rose, stepped barefoot across the cold floor, lifted the lid, sat in silence, not a sound. Because even this had its dignity. And in the morning, the pot was emptied. Or not. Sometimes, if the fever came in the night, if the coughing didn't stop, the pot remained, untouched, unnoticed, until the neighbor knocked. And no one answered. Then, even the chamber pot became a clue, a story, a testament to the day before. Because what they left behind, even in waste, even in stench, was proof of living. Proof that someone had been there, had eaten, had endured. There's a kind of sorrow in that. But there's also something human. They didn't have flush toilets or privacy or lavender sprays. They had pots and patience and the rhythm of doing what needed to be done. One grandmother, it's sighed, painted flowers on hers, not to decorate, but to feel something soft while doing something hard. Another man carved his name into the handle. Because in a house of 12, even your chamber pot was something to claim. And when winter came, and the windows froze shut, and the streets turned to sludge, still someone tossed the pot. Still someone cried the warning. Or didn't. And the city kept breathing, stinking, yes, but breathing. So now, when we picture those times, we often forget this part. The pots, the tosses, the smell beneath the scent of incense in the churches. But they were there, every day, every night, unseen, unspoken. but not unloved Dot, because even in the most undignified corners of life, they managed, somehow, to keep going. He smelled of iron and soap when he could find it, and something faintly bitter, like old herbs or boiled wool left too long in the sun. He wasn't a doctor, but when people were desperate, they didn't ask for degrees. They asked for hands that knew how to hold a blade steady. And his always did. The barber shop was not a shop. It was a room, a bench, a stool, a window that barely opened. Hooks on the wall held razors, scissors, a saw, and a cloth that had not been white in years. He trimmed beards, cut hair, pulled teeth, lanced boils, drew blood. They came in for a shave, left with a bandage. Some called it healing. Others called it guessing. But no one called it nothing, because when the fever came, when the throat swelled, when the skin turned black at the edges, he was still open, and that alone made him holy. He did not wear a beaked mask. He wore an apron, thick leather, stiff with use. It bore stains he no longer tried to scrub away. He didn't flinch at the sight of blood. Not anymore. He'd seen too much of it, in bowls, in rags, in puddles beneath the stool when the tooth came out harder than expected. But still, they came. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below, and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. A boy would sit on the edge of the chair, feet dangling, eyes wide. "Just a trim," he'd whisper. The barber would nod, scissors in hand. Snip, snip, Dot, and for a moment, just a moment, the world would feel normal. Elsewhere, a man would arrive coughing, clutching his chest, asking not with words, but with eyes, for something, anything, to make it stop. The barber would nod again, heat the blade, open the skin just enough to let the sickness bleed out, or so they believed. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes it didn't. But always, it meant someone had tried Dot in those years. There was no line between healing and harming, only intent. And Hoke got the barber worked by candlelight, his hands steady even when the room spun with the smell. Oaf rot. He spoke little. He listened much. Confessions came easily in his chair. People were vulnerable when they bled, and he became their witness. He kept no records, only memories, and scars on his hands where razors had slipped. He mixed his own. Tonics, garlic, wine, vinegar. Sometimes it stung. Sometimes it soothed. No one asked for ingredients. They only asked, "Will it help?" And he would shrug, but still offer the bottle. In the colder months, his shop stayed warmer than most. The boiling water, the constant motion, the breath of those who came and left. Even the sick preferred to die there, upright, shaved, tended to, than alone in a straw bed at home. He prepared bodies too, shaved the dead, cleaned them with what little he had, wrapped them in cloth and said no words, because sometimes silence was the only prayer left. Women came too, in secret, for poultices, for cuts, for comfort. He never asked questions. Never. Turned them away. His hands were rough, but careful. He'd seen enough pain to know how to soften it. Children feared him, then adored him. He gave them boiled sweets when he could find them, not to buy affection, but because life was bitter enough. And though he never claimed to be a healer, they called him that anyway. He carried stories in his pockets, names, no longer spoken, faces seen only once, then gone. He knew which husband was sick before the wife did, which child wouldn't make it through the night, and he kept those things quiet, tucked into his silence like folded notes in a drawer. Some say he stopped trimming hair toward the end, that the weight of grief dulled even his sharpest blade. But he kept his door open. Always. because the barber didn't just cut. He bore witness to the filth, the fear, the tiny flickers of beauty in a world that kept losing its light. And when he passed, quietly, in his chair, tools beside him, no one replaced him. Not because they couldn't, but because no one else would ever carry. It all the blood, the laughter, the trust. That was his alone. The door closed behind them. Wooden, heavy, warm to the touch. And inside, nothing but steam and silence, and the soft drip of water down the walls. They called it a sweating hut, or a vapor room, or, when they were feeling brave, a devil's chamber, because what happened inside wasn't just about health. It was about purging, cleansing, exorcising the body, not of spirits, perhaps, but of shadows. They believed sickness lived inside, not just in the blood or lungs or skin, but deeper, in the soul, in the sorrow, in the parts of a person too quiet to name Dot. And so they gathered. Men, women, sometimes children, naked or wrapped in linen, sitting on benches of smooth stone or cracked wood, steam curling around their ankles like fog, rising into their hair. It smelled of pine, of sweat, of something burned earlier that day. A sprig of rosemary, perhaps, or the edge of a prayer. No one spoke much. The heat made speaking feel unnecessary. Breathing itself became a task, and that was the point. They believed the heat would draw it out, the illness, the weakness, the devil. They didn't mean horns and fire. They meant the devil of despair, the devil of breath gone shallow, the devil that took a child from her mother and left the cradle cold. They believed sweat could banish it. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. So they sat, quiet, dripping, hands on knees, eyes closed, bodies steaming like pots left too long on the fire. Sometimes they'd sing, low, wordless hums, the kind of sounds that feel like rocking chairs, like heartbeat, like hope. Other times, they'd cry, not loudly, just enough to feel it leave them. The strongest among them poured water on the stones. The hiss echoed like a serpent, and the heat surged. It filled the lungs. It made the skin tingle. It made the world feel far away. And they liked that, because the world was heavy. And outside the hut, death walked with confidence. But inside, at least for a while, it couldn't see them. They believed the sweating was sacred. They emerged slick, shining, raw, like newborns, like candles just snuffed out, their faces pink, their limbs trembling. Some collapsed, some smiled, but all of them felt lighter. The fever might return, the cough might deepen, but for that one moment they had forced something out, and even if it wasn't the devil, it was something. The women often went in last, cleaned the benches with ash and cloth, left the door open for the steam to drift into the village, because even the scent of it, even the ghost of heat, felt healing. Not everyone believed. Some said it was dangerous, that the heat weakened the heart, that it opened the pores too wide and let the sickness in. But belief was stronger than science then, and belief gave comfort. The huts were small, circular, often, no windows, only one door, and the fire at the center. The beating heart never fully died, not even in sleep. The stones glowed long after the flames fell away, and in that glow, they saw themselves not as victims, but as survivors, stripped bare, dripping, alive. They didn't take turns because of modesty. They took turns because of space, because of breath. The air grew thick, heavier than water. And to breathe, it was to believe you could survive anything. When a child sweated, for the first time, they marked the occasion. A drop on the forehead, a name whispered, a cloth wrapped tight afterward, not to dry, but to hold the heat and to hold the cleansing. And in winter, the steam rose into the night like a spirit, soft, visible, unbothered, and neighbors, watching from shuttered windows, felt braver just knowing someone inside was sweating out the devil. The huts are gone now, mostly, but the idea remains. That heat can heal. That sweat can save. That somewhere, inside each of us, there is something dark and something bright. And sometimes, they just need to be coaxed out. It wasn't soft. Not really. Not in the way we think of beds now, with their springs and sheets and clean cotton corners. No, it was straw and wood, and the smell of sleep held tight in woolen folds. It sagged in the middle, sloped toward the cold wall, crackled when you lay down, as if the bed was sighing too, and you never washed it. Not once. Not truly. You might shake the blanket, replace the straw every season, if you were lucky, or if the fleas became too bold. But the fabric, the mattress, the bedding? No, they were never washed, because where would you wash them? How? With what water? With what time? So the bed kept everything. Every flake of skin, every drop of sweat, every sickness, healed or not. It smelled of bodies, of long nights, of shared breath and shared silence. And still, it was precious, because to have a bed, even an unwashed one, was to have a place. In the world, some didn't. Some slept on floors, on cloaks, on sacks filled with grain or rags or memory. But those who had a bed knew its worth. They didn't complain when it was damp, or when the lice bit more fiercely in the night. They only curled tighter, wrapped the blanket, heavy with weeks of smoke and sweat, around their shoulders, and slept anyway. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video, and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Sometimes entire families shared one bed, parents at the edges, children tangled in the middle, breath rising and falling in uneven rhythm. It wasn't comfortable, but it was warm, and warmth was survival. They slept in their clothes, boots sometimes still on, a cloak used as a pillow, hair unbrushed, faces unwashed. The straw beneath them whispered with every movement. It broke beneath elbows and knees, flattened beneath weight. And with time, it changed. It became soft at first, then matted, then moldy, but still, they lay down, because the bed, that pile of straw and hope, was where they stopped pretending. It was where the day ended, where the body surrendered, where the tears were quiet, and the dreams tried their best to be kind. Mothers soothed children there, held them through fevers, sang lullabies into lice-filled hair. Fathers turned away from the draft in the wall, coughed quietly, held hands under the blanket when they could. And when someone didn't wake up, they didn't take the bed away. They simply shifted, slept beside the memory, and carried on. In the darkest months, the bed was a battlefield, a place where sickness wrestled with breath, where moans were muffled into cloth, where sleep was shallow, but better than nothing. People prayed in their beds, not always aloud, but with their posture, with their stillness, with the way they pulled the blanket up to their chin like a shield. The blanket, if you had one, was never clean either. It absorbed the years, the sorrow, the skin, but it was yours. And that meant something. Sometimes they stuffed lavender in the straw, or mint or ashes, to keep the bugs away. But mostly they simply endured, woke with straw clinging to their cheeks, with backs sore, with limbs tangled, and still they smiled. Sometimes because the bed was where love lived too, where children were made, where secrets were whispered, where hands found each other in the dark. It didn't matter that. It was never washed, because it held what mattered: warmth, touch, rest. And when the world outside was cold and cruel, when the sickness knocked at the neighbor's door, when food was scarce and firewood scarcer still, the bed remained. It groaned, it crunched, it cradl, and beneath its weight, people dreamed. Not of castles, not of silk. But of another night, together, of another morning. Even if the sun took its time, the bed you never washed wasn't a failure. It was a comfort, a confession, a quiet place in a world too loud with loss. And when they rose each morning, they didn't say thank you, but they looked at it softly, as if it had done something noble. And maybe it had. She didn't wear a crown. She wore a shawl, pulled tight around her shoulders, smelling faintly of firewood, flour, and the baby she buried last spring. Her hands were cracked, not from age, but from ash, the kind that clung to fingers after stoking the fire, after wiping a fevered brow, after boiling the same pot of water 3 times in a day just to be sure it was clean. She was a mother. Not the kind painted on church walls, not quiet and haloed, holding perfect children beneath perfect skies. No, she was the kind that worked, the kind that woke before the sun and didn't stop moving until darkness made the dirt on her hands invisible. She didn't complain. She didn't rest much either, but she touched everything with a kind of reverence. She knew that the fire needed coaxing, that the baby needed rocking, that the bread wouldn't rise without warmth, and neither would her children. And so she gave them what warmth she had. With hands blackened from the hearth, she rubbed soot onto her daughter's cheeks. Not for punishment, for protection. A soft layer between skin and sickness. She dipped cloth into water so hot it steamed her palms, wiped the foreheads of sons who had not stopped coughing, didn't flinch when they sneezed into her sleeve, was used to being close to danger. Mothers always are. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. In the corner of the room, she kept a bowl of ashes, fresh from the fire. Still warm, she stirred it with a wooden spoon, dipped her fingers in, then pressed them to her temples, whispering words not meant for anyone but the smoke. She cleaned without water. She soothed without balm. She braided her daughter's hair with fingers still dusted from the stove, and her children never said thank you, because children never do. But they leaned into her touch, and that was enough. At night, when the fire dimmed and the shadows grew bold, she sat by the bed and sang, not loudly, not well. Just enough. The kind of lullaby you don't remember the tune to, only how it made you feel. She rubbed her hands together in the dark, trying to clean them, though she knew the soot never left. She didn't mind. The ash was her proof that she was still here, still working, still holding the home together with nothing but muscle and memory. Some say she had eyes that saw everything. The lice in the hair, the cut on the heel, the way her husband held his breath when he stood. Too fast, she never spoke her worries aloud. She just fixed what she could and prayed for what she couldn't. Sometimes she prayed with her hands, kneading dough, hanging herbs, rubbing oil into skin that was too hot, too pale, too close to the edge. She prayed with motion, and that motion kept her children alive. When one didn't make it, she buried him with her own hands, placed a bit of rosemary in his pocket, and then returned to the fire, because the others still needed to eat. No tears. Not then. Later, maybe. While scrubbing the floor, no one had asked her to clean. They say a mother's love is endless, but in truth, it's quiet, hidden. It lives in the ashes. In the way she folds the same blanket each morning, in the way she remembers who ate last, in the way she holds a child close, even when her arms ache, And in the plague years, it was all they had. Fathers fell, priests grew silent, doctors fled, but the mothers stayed, at the bedside, at the fire, at the center of the storm, with hands that bore the weight of everything, and never asked to be seen. Some wrote nothing down, their names lost to time, but the soot on their fingers, that was a signature, a mark left on every loaf of bread, every fever cooled, every child who made it through the night. And when they finally slept, if they slept, it was with hands curled inward, as if still holding something. And maybe they were a child, a memory, a flame, or maybe just the echo of everything they gave. They smelled sweet, not like flowers, but like something rotting beneath perfume, the kind of scent that made you pause, not because it pleased you, but because it tried too hard. These were the nobles, the lords, the ladies, the ones in tapestried halls and high-backed chairs. They wore silk, velvet, gowns that trailed across stone floors no one had swept in weeks. They looked clean from a distance, but up close, their sleeves were embroidered and stiff with sweat. Their collars shimmered and itched with lice. Their faces powdered to hide disease, not to dazzle, because the truth was, they bathed less than the peasants. Water was feared in every class, but the rich had more reasons, more people to touch them, more cloth to hide the truth, more fear of looking mortal. So they layered and layered and layered again, not to stay warm, not even for fashion, but to trap the stench. The nobleman's tunic had never seen soap. His boots had never been fully dry. His skin, beneath the gold rings and leather gloves, was just as gray as the butcher's boy, but better hidden. And still, they looked down. From balconies, from horses, from portraits painted with generous imagination. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Their bathhouses were private, rarely used, filled more with rumor than steam. When they did bathe, it was ritual, rose petals, wine poured into the tub, a servant holding the sponge like it was sacred. But these moments were rare, annual, perhaps, a preparation for a feast, or a marriage, or a burial. The rest of the time, they relied on scent. Not the clean kind, not soap or scrubbed linen, but spices, saffron, cinnamon, clove, pouches of herbs sewn into their sleeves, oils dabbed behind the ears, pastes rubbed into the scalp to mask the oils already there. And still, when they moved, they carried an air with them, not of wealth, but of rotting lavender and anxious skin. Servants knew. They were the ones who cleaned the chamber pots, who folded the nightshirts soaked through with sweat, who brushed the wigs that crawled with unseen life. But they said nothing, because silence kept them fed. And besides, they had their own rituals. Basin behind the pantry, a stolen moment with a damp cloth, a prayer whispered into the steam of boiled linens. Cleanliness wasn't classed, only disguised, because dirt didn't care. It crept into castles as easily as cottages, settled into the folds of silk just as softly as into straw. The plague didn't ask how much land you owned. It only asked if you had lungs. And the nobles, despite their lace and lineage, were not immune. They coughed too. They bled. They wept behind heavy curtains, their cries muffled by the same velvet they once wore to dance. When one died, they were wrapped in finery, carried out with song. But underneath it all, the body told the truth. Fleas don't bow, and neither does death. Some whispered in the kitchens and the stables that the peasants were cleaner, not because they bathed more, but because their dirt was honest. They scrubbed with ash. They sweated openly. They washed in rivers when they dared, and when they stank, they called it what it was: life, labor, the smell of survival. But the nobles, they masked it, tried to perfume away their humanity, and in doing so, made themselves strange. There was a prince once, they say, who refused to change his robe for an entire season. He believed the scent of his oils would ward off the plague, .did, and single quotes T. And when the servants carried his body out, they wept, not for his death, but for the smell that lingered in the room for days. The myth of the clean noble was a painting, an illusion hung on cold stone walls, but the truth lived elsewhere, in the creases of their gloves, in the seams of their gowns, in the quiet cough behind the banquet table, and no matter how high the castle walls, the dirt always found a way in. There came a moment in every home when the fire no longer mattered, when the pot on the stove was left untouched, when the straw bed, still warm, became too still. Someone had died, and in that silence, thicker than ash, deeper than dark, the living had to decide what to do next. They didn't have hearses, or embalming rooms, or linen gloves and polished wood. They had cloth. They had water, if they dared use it, and they had their hands so they washed the dead, gently, not because it was expected, not even because they believed it would keep the sickness away, but because it felt right. The washing wasn't hurried. It was slow, deliberate, tender, a basin placed beside the body, a cloth dipped in boiled water, wringed out, laid across a forehead that no longer furrowed in sleep, wiped the lips, the hands, the feet. Not to cleanse, but to comfort. To make the goodbye softer, even when fear gripped them, when the village whispered that the body still carried plague. Still, someone stayed. A daughter, a husband, a neighbor brave enough to kneel beside a friend. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. They would open the shutters, let in the wind, say it helped carry the soul out, and as the sunlight touched the floor, dusty, gold, holy, they did their work. They dressed the dead in their best, even if best was a tunic without holes, or a ribbon tucked into a braid, or a sprig of dried lavender slipped beneath the collar. These small things mattered. Because grief in those years didn't come with flowers or speeches. It came with silence, with hands that kept moving, because stopping would mean breaking. And so, hygiene became a ritual of mourning. To wipe the brow, to wash the feet, to clean the fingernails, to smooth the folds of a shirt last worn in laughter. They did not flinch at the scent. They did not turn from the stillness. They cleaned because it was the only thing left to give. Children watched from doorways, wide-eyed, holding blankets close to their mouths. They learned early what love looked like at the end. Not loud, not weeping, but warm water, a quiet cloth, the closing of eyelids with 2 ashen fingers. Sometimes a priest came, sometimes not, but always someone cleaned. They combed the hair, brushed the dust from lashes, tucked the hands neatly over the chest, and then they wrapped the body, not in silks, not in white, but in whatever cloth they could spare, a blanket, a shawl, a wedding veil. Once, they tied the ends gently, like they were wrapping bread, or a gift, because even death deserved dignity. In towns too crowded for burial, the bodies were carried away quickly. But still, someone took the time to fold the sleeves, to kiss the forehead, to whisper, "I'm sorry," before closing the door behind them. No one taught them to do it. No one paid them to. But every village had someone, a midwife who had turned into a death wife, a cousin, a child who had done it once and learned how to do it again. They didn't speak of it later. They didn't boast. They just did it. And in doing so, they kept the world from becoming unbearable. Because even in the worst of it, when the sickness claimed 10 a day, when the carts rolled by at dawn and dusk, when the air smelled more of endings than beginnings, there was still one person kneeling by a bed with a cloth and a bowl of warm water. And for a few minutes more, cleanliness was kindness. Not to cure, not to protect, but to honor. The dead did not ask to be remembered, but the living remembered them anyway, in the way they folded the final blanket, the way they whispered a name through cracked lips, the way they rinsed the bowl when it was done. And then they went back to living. They stoked the fire, swept the floor, held the children a little closer that night. And the cloth, still damp, still warm, was hung by the hearth. It would dry. It would be used again, because the goodbye never ended. It only softened. Like the last steam rising from the bowl, the door creaked open, but no one stirred. No fire burned in the hearth. No kettle steamed. No voices murmured from the far. Room. Only stillness. The floor was swept. The bed was made. The basin by the wall was full, as if waiting for hands that would never return. It was clean, but the kind of clean that made your stomach turn. Too tidy, too still, too careful. This wasn't the order of a lived-in home. This was the order left behind. Someone had cleaned this place. After the cough, after the fever, after the bodies were taken, they had swept, they had folded, they had placed the shoes by the wall just so. Maybe it was a neighbor, maybe a cousin, maybe someone who owed a debt or just couldn't bear to see the dust fall on memory. But whoever it was, they'd left no fingerprints, only silence, and the silence was thick, not with peace, but with absence, the kind of quiet that hummed in your ears. The kind that made you whisper, even when no one could hear you. Some called it the clean of the gone. The state a home takes when its people are carried out, but haven't yet faded from the walls. The smell still lingers. Soap, ash, dried thyme hanging from the ceiling, but it's hollow now. As if the room is trying to remember what warmth felt like. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe. If you'd like more nights like this, there's a firewood stack by the door, unburned, dry, neatly piled by. Someone who thought they'd need it again. The broom leans in the corner, its bristles still dusted with the last room swept. A small pile of straw gathered, but never tossed. And the table, set for one more meal. A bowl, a spoon, an empty cup. They didn't get to clear it. It's in these places that grief lingers longest. Not in the wails, not in the funerals, but in the polished floorboards, the folded blankets, the 2 smooth bed sheets. Because nothing will disturb them. Now, even the mice tread lightly. Even the breeze from the cracked window seems to pause at the threshold. And the neighbors, they walk past quickly. They don't knock. They don't speak the names, because a clean, empty house is a kind of grave, and no one wants to visit one of those after dark. But still, someone must have come. Someone lit the final candle. Someone laid the soap bar on the edge of the basin. Someone looked at the wall, at the drying herbs, and thought, they would have liked this. And then they left. The door closed softly, not slammed, not locked, just closed. And that's how it remains. A home no longer lived in, but not yet claimed by time. Dustless, frozen. A place where nothing smells of life anymore, but nothing smells of death either. Just nothing. And that's the hardest part. Not the cries, not the coughing, but the quiet, because it feels like betrayal. As if the home itself is pretending no one ever lived there. As if the blankets were always folded, as if no one ever spilled broth across the floor or laughed so hard they cried. But we know better. We know. Someone scrubbed these floors until their knuckles bled. We know someone brushed a child's hair beside that hearth. We know someone whispered a prayer while washing a face for the last time. And now, the silence holds it all. Not with reverence, but with resignation. Eventually, the dust will come. The mice will return. The wind will carry in leaves and dirt and the noise of a world that keeps moving. But for now, the home remains untouched. Untouched. Too clean. The kind of clean that doesn't invite visitors. That doesn't feel proud. That doesn't feel like life. Only like the echo of it. And somewhere, not far, someone remembers. Someone closes their eyes at night and still sees the basin. Still smells the thyme. Still dreams of the bed they helped make one final time. And maybe, in those dreams, the silence softens, becomes a lullaby, becomes a place to rest, not mourn, because even in a house scrubbed clean of its people, love lingers unseen, unmoved. Like a chair pulled out, waiting for someone to sit again. They didn't wear halos, just aprons, frayed at the edges, stiff with use, stained in places no soap could reach. They weren't saints in the way the books described. No miracles, no glowing skin, but they carried water. They carried rags. They carried those no one else would touch. These were the women of the cloth and the women of the corner houses. The nuns, the widows, the mothers whose children were grown or gone. And when the plague came, they didn't run. They stayed, with sponge in hand, with oil in their apron pocket, with a cloth already damp, because they had known it would be needed. Again. They did not shout. They did not demand. They knocked softly, or didn't knock at all. They entered rooms where others had fled, rooms where the air felt heavy with breath that wouldn't last, rooms where silence had already begun to settle like dust on the floorboards. And there, in those rooms, they worked. They wiped fevered foreheads. They sponged cracked lips. They lifted limbs too tired to move. They whispered prayers not for healing, but for peace. They did not ask to be brave. They just were. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. They carried the scent of vinegar and thyme. They wore gloves made of cloth, sometimes none at all. Their hands were calloused, their sleeves damp, their feet sore from hours spent kneeling beside beds made of straw and sorrow. They washed away vomit, caught blood in cloths that would never be clean again, and held people who hadn't been touched in days or weeks or longer. Not with disgust, but with something like love. They sang sometimes, low, wordless tunes that filled the cracks in the walls. That made a dying man feel, for one moment, like he was not alone. They stayed longer than needed, because no one should die without company. They cleaned wounds, brushed hair, lit candles when the firewood ran out. And when the last breath came, they closed the eyes, carefully, gently, as if sleep might still come after all. And they washed the body, wrapped it, and sat beside it until someone came to take it away, or didn't. Sometimes they buried the dead themselves, in graves dug by hands already blistered, with crosses made from scrap wood, names whispered softly into the wind. No ceremony, only silence, and the echo of care. They did not fear the plague like others did, not because they were immune, but because fear wasted time, and time was precious. They knew they couldn't save everyone, but they could clean a face, offer water, hold a hand, and sometimes that was enough. Their names weren't written down, not often, but their touch lived on. In the memories of those who survived, in the quiet comfort of a mother, remembering how her child was bathed at the end, In the way a village whispered, she came for him. Even then, they didn't ask for praise. They asked for more cloth, more water, more soap. And when those ran out, they used spit, used tears, used whatever they had, because dignity wasn't in the tools. It was in the effort. They were often tired, bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that lived deep in the joints, but still they returned, day after day, house after house. They did not preach. They did not beg. They just arrived, cleansed, stayed. And when the plague passed, when the bells stopped tolling and the markets reopened, many of them were gone, but their work remained. The memory of a clean cloth, a gentle hand, a whispered tune in a darkened room. And for those who lived, that was what they remembered most. Not the smell, not the fear, not even the death, but the kindness that came when everything else had vanished. So no, they did not wear halos, but they carried light. In basins, in buckets, in sponges soaked with something more than water. And when they left a room, they left it cleaner, quieter, and somehow, despite everything, still full of grace. They were gone. Most of them, anyway. Not from age, not always, but from rot, from bread too hard, from grinding grains with jaws meant for softer things. Toothless, but not broken. Because even in a mouth half empty, pride still lived. They didn't smile less. They just smiled differently, with lips drawn tight, with eyes doing more of the work. Some learned to hide it. A hand raised mid-laugh, a scarf tugged over the mouth on colder mornings. But the loss was never truly shameful. It was expected. Teeth were luxury, not permanence. And the things they ate didn't help. Stews left too long on the fire. Black bread crusted at the edges. Roots boiled until tender, if there was enough wood to boil them. But even with missing teeth, they ate, because eating meant living. And the mouth adapted. Gums grew strong. Tongues learned to shift the food just right. They tore. They chewed. They managed. There was no dentist to visit. No ivory tools. No numbing powder. If a tooth went bad, someone pulled it. Usually the barber, or a cousin with a strong grip. A twist, a crack, a rag to bite down on. And then, it was over. The gap was rinsed with salt, or wine, or nothing. And they moved on. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Mouths were not mirrors of vanity. They were tools for speaking, for singing, for kissing a child's forehead at night, even if the breath wasn't sweet. They didn't brush, not like we do now. Some wiped with cloth. Some chewed mint or parsley when they had it. Some swished vinegar or rubbed ash along their gums. But mostly they endured the ache, the sharp edge of a tooth worn thin, the quiet throb beneath the jaw on cold nights. They didn't complain much. What was the point? Pain was just part of being alive. And they'd seen worse. A man might be missing 6 teeth, but if he could whistle a tune while walking to the well, he was still himself. A woman might hum with her lips closed, because her molars had long since left her, but her voice was still sweet. And the children, they learned early that smiles didn't need to be perfect. Just real. There was beauty in that. In a grandmother's grin, all gums and warmth. In the laughter that rose from a toothless mouth, louder than any plague bell. They used what they had. They kissed with care. They whispered stories with mouths that bore the years. And still, somehow, they spoke with pride, even when the words came slower. Even when the whistles turned to wheezes, they carved spoons to be smaller, cooked porridge longer, broke bread with the heel of a hand before passing it across the table. They adapted, because the mouth, like the heart, was made to survive. Some old men carved false teeth from wood. Crude, uncomfortable, but it made them feel whole. One woman, they say, kept a polished stone in her cheek, said it helped her speak more clearly, said it reminded her of the tooth she'd lost while laughing too hard at a joke. And maybe that was enough. No one pitied the toothless. They'd earned their gaps, their silences, their soft-spoken wisdom. In a world obsessed with staying alive, the mouth became a quiet monument. To loss, to endurance, to the strange joy of saying, "I'm still here," even if you said it with fewer teeth than you had the year before. So they kept smiling, kept speaking, kept passing stories from one tired mouth to another, because even when the mouth failed, the voice didn't. And when the day ended, and the fire was low, and the bread had been softened in broth, they leaned back and smiled into the shadows, toothless, but proud. You could smell someone before you saw them. A father smelled of sweat and earth, from long hours bent in the fields, hands buried in soil, boots soaked through with morning frost. A mother carried the scent of ash and warm bread, of wool still damp from hanging by the hearth, of rosemary, tucked in her apron not for flavor, but for faith. A child smelled of milk and dust, and the outside, of running barefoot through damp grass and straw-strewn paths. Everyone had their scent. It wasn't perfume. It wasn't artificial. It was truth. In the years of plague and prayer, people didn't define themselves by how clean they were. They defined themselves by how they lived. And that life left a trace. Some smelled of iron, from bloodied cloths and butchered meat. Others of oil, linseed for tools, lard for hands, wax for boots. The sick carried a scent, too. It crept into the corners of the room before the fever showed on the face. Sweet, then sour, then heavy. Like the air itself had started to mourn. But the healthy, they carried the aroma of the living, of breath, of labor, of shared beds and unwashed hair and everything human. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Clothing remembered everything. A woolen tunic, worn for weeks, held the scent of every fire. It passed, every meal spilled, every hug, every cough, every rush through the rain. They did not wash them often, only when desperate. And even then, it wasn't with soap. Just water, cold, or soaked in ash and vinegar, then dried in wind and sunlight. So the scent remained. Had aromas, too. A thatched roof kept the smell of rain. A kitchen reeked of boiled cabbage. A bed, a mixture of straw, skin, and sleep. No candle could hide it. No flower could replace it. But it wasn't shameful. Not then. They knew each other by scent. A lover was recognized in the dark, not by their footsteps, but by the smell of their breath. Warm, tired, real. A child was identified not by their cry, but by the faint scent of skin still kissed by sun and soot. And the dying, their scent changed slowly. Not suddenly. Just enough to make a wife pause in the doorway, to make a brother pull his cloak tighter, to make a mother reach for a cloth, dipped in rosemary and hope. Even animals knew. Dogs barked less. Cats left quietly, as if they, too, recognized the moment as scent turned from presence to absence. But scent was memory. Long after a loved one had gone, their pillow still carried them. Their shawl still clung to their shape. Their scarf still made someone weep when folded too neatly. In the churches, incense filled the air. A fragrant fog meant to lift prayers upward. But even that holy scent could not erase the aroma of the congregation, the farmers, the bakers, the mothers, the sinners. The living, because to be alive was to smell. Of fire, of fatigue, of resilience. A noble might carry spices sewn into his sleeves, masks against the truth of his own breath. But no silk robe could truly hide what the body confessed. And so, they learned to accept it, to breathe it in, to recognize, to love, despite, or maybe because that scent, that raw, tangled fragrance of life, was proof that someone had worked, that someone had cried, that someone had existed. There was a girl who once fell in love not with a face, but with the way he smelled after hours in the sun, a mix of hay and sweat and something soft she couldn't name. There was a boy who remembered his mother not by her voice, but by the scent of thyme and ash on her hands when she tucked him into bed. And those memories, they never washed away. Even now, we carry the ghost of those scents, in stories, in fabric, in the breath of old books and wooden walls. And when we think of them, the people who lived through hunger, through heat, through hurt, we think of how they must have smelled, not like lavender, but like life. There were no baths. Not anymore. Not like before. The tubs sat dry in corners. The wooden basins, once polished by steam and skin, now filled with dust and silence. But the songs remained. They hummed through kitchens, whispered from the lips of women kneading dough, drifted from children as they played in the dirt. Bathing songs, cleanliness songs, songs from a time when water was not fear, but comfort. They were soft, rhymed, easy to remember like prayers, but warmer somehow. Scrub the toes, and scrub the knees, then ask the fire, "May I wash, please?" No one remembered where it came from, only that mothers sang it when wiping faces with cold cloths. Only that grandmothers rocked to its rhythm, even when there was no basin near, no towel, no soap. It was all memory. A song to pretend, a song to soothe, because the act, bathing, had become a ghost. Too risky, too rare. But a song? A song could make the mind remember warmth. In one village, they sang while brushing hair. Down the river, down the stream, find your hands, find your clean. They didn't explain the lyrics. They didn't need to. The melody did the work, lulling, swaying, softening the edges of another long day. And even without water, the songs made people feel washed. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Children never knew real baths. Only stories of them. Stories of tubs filled on market days, of soap that foamed like clouds, of skin left pink and soft. But the children knew the songs. They sang them while drawing in the ash, while dipping fingers into puddles, while splashing rainwater with bare feet and wide eyes. They carried the memory without ever having lived it, as if melody could pass on what water no longer could. A woman once whispered, "If I can't bathe my baby, I can still sing her clean." And she did, every night. The same tune, the same 3 lines. Wiped her child's face with a warm cloth, then wrapped her in a shawl still damp from the hearth. It wasn't a bath, but it was enough. The songs made everything gentler, even death. In sick rooms, a sister might hum as she pressed a rag to a fevered brow, not loudly, not for anyone else. Just for the dying, because in those moments you didn't need soap. You needed sound. You needed someone to stay. They sang of rosewater, of combs carved from cherry wood, of soap that smelled like spring. Things they didn't have, but things they remembered. And in remembering, they survived. A man without teeth, whose back ached from years of stonework, once sang while trimming his beard. "Wash away the day," he muttered. "Wash away the day." Even though the water was cold, even though the soap was a lump the size of a walnut, the song made it feel possible. Cleanliness became less about scrubbing, more about story. About the feeling that came when your grandmother's voice filled the room as she wrung out a rag and touched your Forehead Dot about the way your mother tapped the bucket to the beat of a tune no one had written down. The bath was gone, but the memory remained, wrapped in rhyme, soft as steam, persistent as a lullaby. And sometimes, when no one was looking, someone would sing in the dark, not for children, not for the sick, just for themselves. A single line, a quiet hum, something that reminded them they were still here, still worth a song, still deserving of clean. And when the wind moved through the shutters at night, and the fire had gone low, and the cloth by the basin had dried stiff on the line, those songs hovered between beams, beneath the straw, in the breath of those just beginning to sleep. Bathless, maybe, but never unloved Dot. It used to be a gift. The wind, brisk in spring, cool in summer. It rustled wheat, lifted skirts, stirred the clothesline into song. It was how the world breathed, but not during the plague. Then the wind was watched, listened to, blamed, because when the sickness spread, and no one could see how, when water was feared and touch was rare, the wind became the suspect. It blew through cities and left coffins behind. It passed over fields and made the villagers cough. It howled through shutters, and children were found burning with fever the next morning. They didn't understand the science, but they understood pattern, and the wind had become a messenger of lost. So they shut the windows, stuffed wool in the cracks, hung thick curtains, even in the heat. They pressed rags soaked in vinegar against the wood, not to stay warm, but to keep the air out, because air, they believed, had teeth. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. They feared the breeze on their cheeks, feared the sudden gust through an alleyway, feared the long sigh of wind that slipped beneath doors at dusk. Even fresh air, the thing we now call clean, was considered corrupted. It was called bad air, malaria, and they thought it seeped into lungs, nestled in throats, and whispered ruin from inside out. So they changed their rituals. No more airing out linens, no more sleeping with the shutters cracked, no more standing in open doorways to wave goodbye. They turned inward, and the homes grew heavy. The air inside grew stale, but it was safe. Or so they believed. In some places, they burned herbs at this threshold, sage, juniper, to confuse the wind, to distract it, to make it forget who lived there. Others hung garlands of garlic and ash by the window, a message to the breeze. Not here, not tonight. The old women whispered to it, told it to pass by, begged it to leave the children alone. Some prayed into it, some cursed it, but all of them respected it, because they'd seen what came after a storm. They'd seen how quickly one sick child became three, how the smell of sweat turned sour overnight. And always the wind had come before. A soft breeze, a gentle sigh. That was all it took. The doctors wore beaks to protect themselves from it. Long masks stuffed with herbs, filters of crushed flowers. They thought it might keep the air at bay, that the wind carried more than illness. They said it carried judgment, it carried grief, and it carried names, the names of those it had already taken, whispered them down alleyways, into cracks, beneath blankets. So when the wind rose, people lit more candles, boiled more water, wrapped their heads and waited. It became a kind of ritual, a war against what couldn't be touched. Even animals felt it. The cows grew restless, the chickens clucked louder, the dogs howled before the breeze even reached the door. The world, it seemed, knew to hold its breath. But still, the wind came. Always. It couldn't be caught, or killed, or warned, and that made it dangerous. But also, there was beauty in it, because even in their fear, they remembered the wind was life too. It pollinated. It cooled. It carried seeds and scent and hope. There was a child who laughed when the wind knocked over a candle, who chased a leaf down the road, even while her mother called out warnings. There was a man who cracked open the shutter one night, just for a moment, just to remember the smell of rain. And there was a woman, old and ready, who let the wind into her room because she said it was time. It brushed her cheeks, moved her hair, and then was gone. They feared it, but they also needed it, because in that breeze there was something bigger than them. Something wild, unstoppable, real. The wind didn't mean harm. It just moved, and in moving, it reminded them that nothing stays. Not grief, not joy, not plague. And so they feared it, but they also waited for it, because the wind always changed. They were never just nails. They were tools. They were memory. They were proof of soil, of sickness, of a life lived close to the ground. In the folds beneath them, dirt gathered. And not just dirt, ash from the fire, flour from the bread, blood from the last animal that didn't go quietly. There was no soap for them, no clippers, no polish. Only teeth and knives, and the habit of running thumb across fingertip to feel what no one else could see. Fingernails were quiet, but they said everything. About labor, about care, about who you touched and what you carried. A mother's nails were worn flat from washing, from scrubbing, from pressing herbs into cloth and smoothing fevered skin. A child's were scratched and raw, from climbing trees, from hiding stones in pockets, from worry they didn't know how to name. And the dying, their nails turned pale, bluish, still. Someone always noticed. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. It was a small thing, but in a world where not much could be done, it mattered. To clean the nails. Just a little. Before a meal, before a burial, there was no ritual more sacred or more forgotten than this. A mother sitting with her son by the fire, holding his hand in hers, scraping gently beneath each nail with a sliver of wood. Not to scold, but to care, because care lived in the quietest places. In fingernails. In the soft hush of breath as someone checked for fever. In the rubbing of calloused thumbs against one another in silence. Some women painted them, not with lacquer, but with ash, to protect, to mark, to remember something only they understood. Some men bit theirs until the bleeding came, not from hunger, but from helplessness. Children scratched messages into frost on windows, into wooden benches, into bread that hadn't yet cooled. They told stories with their nails, tiny marks, hidden drawings. The only way to leave something behind. When someone died, it was often the nails that told the tale. Soiled, or clean, or broken. You could read a person's end by the state of their hands, and someone always took the time to clean them, gently, softly. With oil, if there was any. With cloth, with love. It wasn't vanity. It was respect, because even the smallest parts of us deserve to be honored. There were old beliefs, too, that nails held part of the soul, that you had to burn the clippings, that if left out, they might be stolen by birds, and that bird would carry your spirit to the wrong place. So they burned them, quietly, with incense. In corners no one swept, not out of fear, but out of tradition, out of memory. Even now, some whisper it, some still clip in secret, still bury the bits, still look down at their hands and remember someone else's, a grandmother's, worn smooth, but never still, a father's, cracked but warm, a friend's, gone too soon, but once held yours tightly when you needed it most. Fingernails. Tiny, unnoticed, uncelebrated, and yet so human. They were where life clung, where labor left its mark, where love often began, in the reaching, the holding, the keeping close. So no, they weren't forgotten. Not really. They were just quiet. Like so much else in those days. But the ones who remembered, the mothers, the healers, the watchers, they knew, they always knew, that beneath every fingertip was a story worth cleaning, worth holding, worth ending softly. It was always there, beneath the wood, asterisk, beneath the straw, beneath the stone and soot and every cracked boot sole that ever touched the threshold. Dirt, not clean, not pure, not poetic, just dirt. But somehow it held everything. The warmth, the rot, the rituals and routines, the silence and the scent. It caught what fell. It softened every footstep. It listened. And in the end, it received. Every body, every basin spilled, every bowl dropped in grief or hunger, every child too, tired to wake. The dirt remembered. Even when the people forgot. It held the stories no one wrote down, the sound of scrubbing, the softness of lullabies sung in rooms with no baths, the echoes of wind that once crept through shutters and made everyone hold their breath. It caught the tears, the spit, the ash, and still, it made things grow. That was its quiet rebellion. To turn suffering into something green, to take death and shape it into roots. They never called it sacred, but they knew the dirt mattered. A good floor, packed and dry, was a kind of prayer. It meant you wouldn't slip. It meant the fire would stay burning. It meant your child wouldn't wake up coughing from the cold that crept in beneath the door. They swept it, always. Even when it seemed pointless. Even when it rained for 5 days, and the mud came back again and again, they still swept. Because care is not about outcome. It's about presence. A woman with a broom in her hand wasn't just fighting dust. She was keeping the world upright. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more. Nights like this. And in the spring, they planted things. Not because they had much hope, but because seeds made silence feel less final. A few onions. Sometime, a stretch of cabbage that might make it through frost. And when the green came, even just a little, they knelt. Not to pray, but to weed, to harvest, to run fingers through the dirt and feel something alive. Children played in it, ate it, sometimes. Mothers sighed, wiped mouths, and didn't scold, because the dirt was safer than most things. It didn't judge, didn't strike, didn't take things away. And when the cough came, when the fever rose, when the wind turned bitter, and the bells tolled in the distance, they still had the ground beneath them. And maybe that was enough. Even now, in our modern beds, in rooms with soap and warm water and too many lights, we still carry the dirt. Under our nails, in our memory. In the lullabies passed down without melody. We dream of it. Not the filth, but the grounding, the sense that somewhere, beneath the hurt, beneath the fear, beneath the years that no one speaks of anymore, something still holds us. The same dirt they walked on, slept near, were buried beneath. And from that dirt, roses grow, and roots, and tenderness. It's easy to look back and judge, to see the filth, the toothlessness, the ash, to imagine them as a people lost or lesser or unaware. But they weren't. They were vivid, alive, holding each other close in the only ways they knew how. They sang when baths were gone. They washed with soot when soap failed. They touched the sick when others fled. They folded blankets with reverence, scraped nails with gentleness, faced the wind with vinegar and prayers. And in the end, when there was nothing left to hold, they placed it all back into the earth. With love, with memory. With the hope that someone, someday, might remember not the smell, but the songs, the silence, but the way they filled it, and not the dirt, but the hands that swept it. So tonight, as you close your eyes, know this: you are held by the same ground. You are rooted in the same tenderness. You are part of the same soft, aching, ordinary story.